Welcome, everybody, to another reading of Bergsonism. This week we are on Chapter 4, One or Many Durations. We are joined here with Cody without organs, our friend Jack, and Joby. So I think before we get started into actually reading it, it has been a few precious weeks since we've actually done a reading of Bergsonism. So maybe let's try to do a little bit of a slight recap of like what's going on so far. Our resident Bergson expert, Jack, I think would be the best to kind of give us this if he's okay with it. But we can also kind of tag team this as well.
So, from chapter 1, intuition as method, we've learned we need to separate, we need to fight against our intellect using intuition. We need to separate differences of kind. We need to first state and be aware of non-existent or false problems, which are non-existent problems and badly stated problems. And then we discover genuine differences in kind using our intuition. And then finally, temporalize and bring that formulation into real time. So chapter 3 jumps all the way through duration into memory. Now, with intuition and with this method, we can completely flatline the duality of body, of mind and matter, of, perception and recollection. So last chapter, we stumbled upon four main propositions of theories of memory and ontological memory. So first, we must leap into ontology, place ourselves at once into the ontological element of the past. This leads into a type of being, a difference in kind between present and the past. This is a paradox of being. We then move into a coexistence. The past does not follow the present, but coexists with it. And finally, a repetition. What coexists with each present is the whole of the past, integrally, on various levels of contraction and relaxation. So, coming into chapter 4, one or many durations, we have to remember that memory is a type of duration. And we have an ontological memory and an ontological element in us surrounding each kind of moment. So, one or many durations, we're gonna find that with separate moments, if each moment has a duration, is there one? Is there several? So this is like the culmination Deleuze has been building us up to, and if you've been following, this is kind of gonna answer a big confusing question, and this follows matter and memory to a T. So again, Bergson is basically answering it, I think, somewhere in chapter 2 of Matter and Memory. But
Cool.
keep that a brief summary of what Deleuze has been doing. This is chapter 4. Then chapter 5, we're going to go into Elan Vital, and he's going to seal this whole thing off. But we really need to answer here. And Matter and Memory, chapter 2, actually gets into some things with duration that Deleuze pulls out of simultaneity, duration and simultaneity. He goes into a further Bergson text, and that's where he's actually... So Bergson starts his discussion on duration in Time and Free Will, but he evolves his discussion of duration into simultaneity. And this is where Deleuze is just kind of shortcutting us here through the corpus of Bergson text. And this chapter is going to just seal the deal. So without further ado, let's let Deleuze do the talking.
Let's get into it. Cool. I'd be happy to...
Oh, sorry, by let Deleuze do the talking, you mean one of us four?
Yes.
Sorry, Joby. I'm happy to start off the reading until it becomes unbearable to keep reading, and then I'll ask someone else to read. So,
do you want to go up to that first break?
Yeah.
It's like 3 pages in, 4 pages in, I think.
I think that's cool.
Yeah, we could do 4 pages each or something.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. One or many durations. Thus far, the Bergsonian method has shown two main aspects: the one dualist, the other monist. First, the diverging lines, or the differences in kind, had to be followed between the turn in experience. Then, still further beyond, the point of convergence of these lines had to be rediscovered, and the rights of the new monism restored. This program is in fact realized in matter and memory. First, we bring out the differences in kind between the two lines of object and subject, between perception and recollection, matter and memory, present and past. What happens next? It certainly seems that when the recollection is actualized, its difference in kind from perception tends to be obliterated. There can no longer be anything but differences in degree between recollection images and perception images. It is for this reason that, without the method of intuition, we inevitably remain prisoners of a badly analyzed psychological composite whose original differences in kind we are unable to discern. But it is still clear that, at this level, a genuine point of unity is not yet available. The point of unity must account for a composite from the other side of the turn in experience. It must not be confused with the one in experience. And in fact, Bergson is not content to say that we are now only differences in degree between the recollection image and the perception image. He also presents a much more important ontological proposition. While the past coexists with its own present, and while it coexists with itself on various levels of contraction, we must recognize that the present itself is only the most contracted level of the past. This time it is pure present and pure past, pure perception and pure recollection as such, pure matter and pure memory, that now have only differences of expansion and contraction, and thus rediscover an ontological unity. But discovering a deeper contraction memory at the heart of recollection memory, we have thus laid the foundation for the possibility of a new monism. At each instant, our perception contracts an incalculable multitude of memorized elements. At each instant, our present infinitely contracts our past. The two terms, which had been separated to begin with, cohere closely together. What in fact is a sensation? It is an operation of contracting trillions of vibrations onto a receptive surface. Quality emerges from this, quality that is nothing other than contracted quantity. This is how the notion of contraction or tension allows us to go beyond the duality of homogeneous quantity and heterogeneous quality, and to pass from one to the other in a continuous movement. But conversely, if our present, though which we place ourselves inside matter, is the most contracted degree of our past, matter itself will be like an infinitely dilated or relaxed past, so relaxed that the preceding moment had disappeared when the following appears. This is how the idea of relaxation or of extension will overcome the duality of the unextended, and the extended will give us the means of passing from one to the other. For perception itself is extensity. Sensation is extensive insofar what it contracts is precisely the extended. The expanded, it makes space available to us in the exact proportion in which we have time available. Hence the importance of matter and memory. Movement is attributed to things themselves so that material things partake directly of duration, and thereby form a limit case of duration. The immediate data are surpassed. Movement is no less outside me than in me, and the self itself is in turn is only one case among others in duration. But then all kinds of problems arise. Let us single out two important ones. Is there not a contradiction between two movements of the method, between the dualism of difference and kind and the monism of contraction relaxation? For, in the name of the first, philosophies that confine themselves to differences of degree of intensity were condemned. Moreover, what were condemned were the false notions of degree of intensity as notions of contrariety or negation, sources of all false problems. Isn't Bergson now in the process of restoring all that he once dismissed? What differences can there be between relaxation and contraction except for the differences of degree of intensity? The present is only the most contracted degree of the past, matter the most relaxed degree of the present. And if we seek to correct what is too gradual here, we can only do so by reintroducing into duration all of the contrariety, all the opposition that Bergson had previously condemned so many abstract and inadequate conceptions. We will only escape from matter as deterioration of duration by embracing a conception of matter that is a reversal of duration. What then becomes the Bergsonian project of showing that difference as difference in kind could and should be understood independently of the negative of deterioration as well as the negative of opposition? The worst contradiction of all seems to be set up at the heart of the system. Everything is reintroduced: degrees, intensities, opposition. 2. Even supposing that this problem is solved, can we speak of a rediscovering monism? In one sense, yes, insofar as everything is duration. But since duration is dissipated in all these differences in degree, intensity, relaxation, and the contraction that affects it, we tend to instead to fall into a kind of quantitative pluralism. Hence the importance of the following question: is duration one or many, and in what sense? Have we really overcome dualism, or have we been engulfed in pluralism? We must begin with this question.
Okay. There's an interesting sentence here. What was it? The present is only the most contracted degree of the past, and matter the most relaxed degree of the present. So as with most things with Bergsonism, every time you take the first stab at trying to get something, you always have to kind of, make a guess in the dark. But for me, the way that because there's quite distinct things being meant by matter, by present, by relaxed degrees, and contracted degrees. But to me, I'm going to stumble through this analogy. The way in which the image that immediately appears to my mind is the if the present is only the most contracted degree of the past, meaning that each present has a particular past that impresses upon it, always touches it, couldn't be without it, then matter is the most obvious thing you can point to in the present moment as an object which is right here, the easiest, most accessible thing in this present moment, which almost seems to hide its own past, right? The past almost doesn't matter for this object because it's here, it's right there. It's like, why do I need to bother about its history? It's there. But I find it interesting how there is a difference between matter in this sense and the present moment. So what other things if the I suppose what I'll say is this: if matter is the most relaxed degree of the present, then what else can you point towards in the present moment to say otherwise, right? Is there anything else you can point towards in a present moment that is not matter that would say otherwise?
So, what you could say is we are in the presence of images. And what that is to say is these images are matter, many different matters. Now, what uh, differs in these different matters, you could say, is two separate things. One, they differ in kind, so they're different movements, but they also differ in degree. So there's a different intensity. There's like a magnitude of intensity we can discern kind of from them. Now, that is kind of what we ascertain in that first apprehension of that, let's call it simple image. So when you say what other matter could you see, it's like it's almost like saying you say let's go back into the present and re-update our data of the lay of the land, because it's like with the last chapter, we found we are to access memory, we first jump into the general past and then a particular past. Well, kind of in the moment, we do the same thing where we jump into the general present and then a particular present. So by doing that particular present, that's actually the most like contracted level. This is where it gets really interesting. And the inverted cone is actually, with all this contraction and expanded stuff, this is the problem. What we find is first we are given a world of essentially unextended objects that we have to give extension to. That's the problem that is really, really strange. So in that process, though, we not only might first understand that there's memory and matter, there's perception and recollection, but at some point they become homogenized, and then we have to ask, well, can we save it? Can we actually get out the parts again, or the parts lost? Now, that's kind of the thing we're looking for here, and you can kind of hear it in this beginning of this paragraph with the fight between pluralism and monism, because it's like if it's been forged, if it's been monized, can it be pluralized again? Or should we just re-grab the data from the present? Go back into the ontological element of the present and get data back out, and then reuse that data. Because again, at all moments we have a flow. We always have flux. The question is, have we grabbed enough of the flux that we can still get at the real, or do we cut our losses and let that little substratum that we've pulled out go away? Because we're not Plato. We're not going to say that every little substratum that we abstract out we have to keep it, let it go. So so if we can take out these little substratums, that means we kind of have infinite little substratums. That's pluralism, right? Well, we're talking about Deleuze here. Pluralism equals monism. There's the Spinoza thing, but where that comes into play again is in perception and recollection, because with perception and recollection, and with chapter 1 of matter and memory, we find ourselves in the presence of images, seemingly infinite images that we're kind of playing games with. We're the controller of, we're painting this little, you could call it canvas, not to get too John Locke, that we're just watching a stage. There's just this stage in our mind that we're just an observer is just watching, and these objects of matter just kind of going across the stage, and then we say, that's it, that's life, and then another moment passes, they go, that's life, and then another. So Bergson and Deleuze are shortcutting us through a lot of these things. So when he's talking about the most contracted moment, it's kind of like that's one of those abstracted. That's one of those things that have been abstracted. For it to be contracted, for it to be objective, for us to all point at objects and say, "Hey, that's an object," and we can agree that that's objective. You know, what we do in that moment is we kind of break away from the internal experience. That to even talk about perception, we have to use affection. We have to pay the price of consciousness. But I won't get too into chapter 1 of matter and memory here, because that's essentially what Deleuze is doing. Is he's abstracting away swaths of Bergson to just get at the core of unfortunately, and right of peeking ahead. I mean, he's about to jump back into matter and memory. So but anybody else?
I mean, I just got there's two things I wanted to bring up really quickly, and that'll just be like, 30 seconds each. The way you said about is this present object enough for us to draw anything from, or do we need to go like delve into an object's past to find a more lossless version of it? It's sort of reminded me of JPEGs. When you save a meme over and over, it's deep fried. But that kind of quality is what people want. They want the loss. Because even with all this lost information and all these JPEG artifacts, the thing that you want is right there, and it's deep fried, and it's staring at you in the face, and it's still recognizable as the image of the meme. But there's a really interesting quality to JPEGs and memes, actually, in the sense that they are timeless, in that all information is multiplicative at origin. So in a weird way, I don't know how applicable conversation surrounding like PNGs and JPEGs would be.
It is. That's actually pretty good.
Because they get frozen in time almost. So there is no sort of I don't know how flux would come into that conversation, but that's perhaps something to talk about later. And the other thing I bring up as well is the thing that you describe with having to come out of intuition, having to come out of perception into something else just in order to talk about perception, is a problem I think a lot of people struggle with in a more effective and general day-to-day sense, when they have a lot to say, but the moment they go and try and share what they have to say, they're immediately burdened and they stumble across their words, and all of a sudden they're not actually sure any longer that they knew they had anything to share, and they sort of embarrass themselves into thinking, actually, I should have just kept my mouth quiet. I shouldn't have tried to share anything because clearly I had nothing to share. But actually, no, what they had was, they had this, clearly they had the impulse to share something, right? They had something there that was like that was like simmering to the surface, and they were just about ready to, and there's something clearly happening in that process that gets in the way, and it tricks people into thinking they are less capable creatures than they are. And I've seen that happen to a lot of people, myself included, as well, where we just kind of, because we cannot jam everything into the machine of grammar and like what comes out on the other side, we feel like, oh, we shouldn't have even bothered. We have no actual ideas, which couldn't be further from the truth. I think there's a lot that escapes that meat grinder, and it's worth sitting with, right? So
yeah, and I think that what you're describing for that specific point is like that. I think Jack would agree with me here that we're literally switching between two different modes of thought whenever we're having the internal monologue of like, oh, here's what I want to say next. I'm really thinking through this point and it's going to be brilliant, to trying to actually make it into something that's extended within the structures of grammar that is in a sense quantified as like a unit of expression, and by unit just a symbol, right, to make it into something that is expressible. That intentional kind of process actually has to be abstracted into something extensional. And yeah, I completely agree with you there. I think that's totally relevant too.
Yeah, I am so fucking smart and sexy and interesting in my head.
No, but what we struggle with in the West is the Einstein has condemned us. He says if you can't explain something simply to a child, you must not understand it yourself. Now, and the Buddha says, it was so clear in my mind but the second I went to say it, it got muddied. That's how it is. I mean, this is because there's this real happening that we struggle to articulate. And we actually find this in Bergsonism, natural articulations of the real. We can't have it, but we settle for something much less, and then we do a trick. Then we forget that we've done that, and then we all go to school and we say, "Hey, no, that's the real," you know. But I digress.
Yeah.
Walter Benjamin. But
I think yeah.
so this is just priming us again. This is essentially the real is it's out there. It's scary. We cannot we struggle to label it, and when we can't label things, unfortunately. But
Real and true.
Jack, would you be
So-
cool with continuing the maybe like 3 to 4 more pages?
yeah,
Cool.
let's do it. Bergson's texts seem to vary considerably on this point. Matter and memory goes further in the affirmation of a radical plurality of durations. The universe is made up of modifications, disturbances, changes of tension and of energy, and nothing else. Bergson does indeed speak of a plurality of rhythms of duration, but in this context, he makes it clear, in relation to durations that are more or less slow or fast, that each duration is an absolute, and that each rhythm is itself a duration. In a key text from 1903, he insists on the progress made since time and free will. Psychological duration, our duration, is now only one case among others, among an infinity of others. A certain well-defined tension, whose very definitiveness seems like a choice between an infinity of possible durations. We can see that, as in matter and memory, psychology is now only an opening onto ontology, a springboard for an installation in being. But no sooner are we installed than we perceive that being is multiple, that very numerous duration, our own, caught between more dispersed durations and more taut, tendu, more intense durations. This being, so one perceives any number of durations, all very different from one another. The idea of a virtual coexistence of all levels of the past, of all the levels of tension, is thus extended to the whole of the universe. This idea no longer simply signifies my relationship with being, but the relationship of all things with being. Everything happens as if the universe was a tremendous memory. Anaxagoras is happy. And Bergson is pleased with the power of the method of intuition. It alone enables us to go beyond idealism as well as realism, Papa bless, to affirm the existence of objects which are inferior and superior to ourselves, although still, in a certain sense, internal to us, to make them coexist together without difficulty. This extension of virtual coexistence to an infinity of specific durations stands out clearly in creative evolution. I wouldn't know, Marxy, where life itself is compared to a memory. The genera or species corresponding to coexisting degrees of this vital memory. Thus, we have an ontological vision that seems to imply a generalized pluralism. But it is precisely in creative evolution that a major limitation is underlined. If things are said to endure, it is less in themselves or absolutely than in relation to the whole of the universe in which they participate insofar as their distinctions are artificial. Thus, the piece of sugar only makes us wait because, in spite of its arbitrary carving out, it opens out onto the universe as a whole. In this sense, each thing no longer has its own duration. The only ones that do are the beings similar to us, psychological duration. Then the living beings that naturally form relative closed systems and finally, the whole of the universe. It is thus a limited, not a generalized pluralism. That's key right there. Um, just pause real quick, Marcy. Anything you could add from creative evolution, because that's a huge, I guess, development in duration we find through the text. And we're going to jump back into duration and simultaneity, but
let me think on that. So let me reread this part. So it says, "In alone and it alone enables us to go beyond idealism as well as realism, to affirm the existence of objects which are inferior and superior to ourselves, although still in a certain sense internal to us, to make them coexist together without difficulty, and that this extension of virtual coexistence to an infinity of specific durations stands out clearly in creative evolution, where life itself is compared to memory, the genera or species corresponding to coexisting degrees of this vital memory." I think maybe what's going on here is the laying out of the two multiplicities, which I think is really vital to creative evolution. A very brief rundown would say the two multiplicities are matter and memory, or that there's this, or you could even say intention, extension. But I think what is going on here is that, like, in Bergson, like you might think that he's just pulling a dualism of saying, like, well, these things are completely different, but really, like, what he says is that they are qualitatively different. Like, there is like a difference in kind between like our intentional, like, subjective experience, as well as like an external, like, objective experience. But these differences are complementary, and they have to be complementary in order for everything to work. And it's because they're different that they are complementary, because if they were homogeneous they wouldn't be complementary.
exactly.
So what I think is going on here, so it says where life is compared to a memory, is that, like, you see life compared to yeah, so, like, I think the life aspect would be a little bit separate from, like, the objective aspect, right? But there is still a wholeness, but I think the life aspect is more the intentional kind of singular experience, as opposed to something that's just divided into, like, homogeneous, like, distinct units of, like, of number. I'm kind of waffling because I'm a little bit, I don't know completely what he's saying here, but maybe y'all can kind of help make
It's
sense.
curious. Yeah, no, what's curious is you're actually illustrating the next I think two lines ahead. If things are said to endure, it is less in themselves or absolutely than in relation to the whole of the universe in which they participate. And that's what is a struggle that I have, and why at some point I'm going to have to dive much further into creative evolution, because
Mm,
it's like each being has this vitality to them,
right.
but it implies a kind of like vital memory, because
Yeah.
like to have like an identity memory, this is where he's like pulling from Plato, but like the degrees of these vital memories, that's where you can have superior or inferior, like relative to you, but at a certain point, again, it has to, even though you have your infinity, at some point we still kind of know there's a binding that has to happen, that you have to bind that infinite perception into
Yeah.
something that is usable and functional. So that's where you kind of bring it back to the real. You kind of bring it back to the whole of the universe. So it's like it's kind of a relation to the whole of the universe, and that's what
Yeah.
personally I struggle with, because in creative evolution, that's the magic that's coming out, is how
This
to
might
kind of factor that in.
Sorry to jump in here. This might be a piss way of thinking about it, but would the idea of a vital memory, would this again, this might be a bit of a crass analogy, but would something like DNA be a vital memory?
Exactly.
It would.
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Okay, we're on the same page then. I was also thinking
Because
as well,
exactly.
um, with vital memory. Is this similar to? So here's an example. Say there is a person and they have an idea for there's a movie that they want to shoot and they want to direct, but oh no, they develop cancer and die within 3 months. They never get to shoot that movie. Nobody gets to see what it was. It sort of dies with them. But um, they're you know they there are other people on the planet, and as people continue to sort of propagate, the potential for anyone to have thought, it's the things that undergird these concepts that we have. It's the undergirding that actually continues. So even if we die and our specific ideas maybe go with us, and all these specific intensities and all these specific kinds of memories and intuitions, they sort of pale away. It's the potential for the same, I guess, creative thought that is passed on. Is that sort of closer to
Yeah.
the vital memory that keeps going down?
It's beautiful. That's beautiful because it reminds me of the last scene in Blade Runner. Not to spoil it,
No, I mean,
that this is the AI. The AI is reconciling what it means to be human. Uh, the AI is lamenting that he has memories that other humans wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the belts of Orion, and all of these memories will be lost if he dies.
Rain.
He is the only one holding these memories. So these memories will be lost like tears in the rain. Now that's what each individual offers. We're all holding on to something, and then we've convinced ourselves what we're holding on to is not only a memory that is precious, but our identity. We're forging an identity from this. Now, this is what sci-fi and then Blade Runner, we find instantly. This is where Blade Runner is using Plato, curious enough, because Plato tells us to have identity, we must have memory. And that's where Bergson is subsuming this idea strongly with creative evolution, because this is what we kind of forge in each moment. This memory that we keep with us is not so static, though. It's rather to pull from, and not to get too far off, to pull from systems philosophy.
Right.
This is what we describe. We don't say memory. Curious enough, we say stock, because it's a dynamic memory. We're constantly it's constantly leaking out, and we're having to repair it. And we choose to actively repair certain elements and let other elements kind of die off. So this is a dynamic process of identity formulation. And then again, we're peeking onto Deleuze's transcendental empiricism here. Pre-subjectivized, individuated beings that we can't, identity poles, not static identity simulacrum. But so again, these are
pre-subjectivized.
The easiest way.
Yeah.
The easiest way to describe it, always with Deleuze, almost as sci-fi, is talking about cinema. But again, you got it. You got it right with the DNA, because this is the problem that we've stumbled upon. Not only are we acting in the world, but we're kind of unfolding a biological DNA that's encoded in us. And we could, if we had a microscope, we could maybe put that and try to use that to predict what our future movements might be. Now that would be like a Minority Report, a kind of thought police, and Bergson would say, no, that is not the same. We need to actualize that before it becomes real. That's just a possibility, and a virtual potential. Again, and this is what we lose when somebody dies. But I digress.
This is this is one of the fears. I don't like to do futurology too much because it's a bit, fucking anyone can say anything. It's a bit crass, right? Everything's up in the air. But the one thing that I will entertain a little bit is we do a little bit of sociology when it comes to public responses to different kinds of industries, and I think healthcare is a huge conversational pathway we can have, and I will only I'll try and limit this to fucking 60 seconds if I can, so we can get back to the reading. But there is this idea that we can uncover the secrets of our genome and have these tailored sort of genomic therapies. We're already sort of seeing people like affluent people who are able to kind of have these. They do the 23andMe, they do they see what they're at risk for. Their genome analyst will suggest different kinds of therapies with their healthcare provider and all this. But we can imagine a world in which perhaps um, this kind of technology gets cheaper, and
Exactly.
obviously it plays with insurance, right? So all of a sudden, if maybe you're at risk of higher cholesterol, but your premiums won't go. I don't know what the terminology is in America because lol, but yeah, like if you have to suddenly pay more because you're not taking some kind of beta blocker, right? All of a sudden you got higher premiums. You're not
Oh,
living in line with your genes. What
exactly.
do genes
Yes.
say? What do genes actually tell you? Like we're looking for answers within ourselves, and yet there aren't any,
Um,
right? Like
Yeah.
we sort of
uh,
continually diving deeper and deeper and deeper. We're sort of turning
um,
inwards, but there's
yes.
Yeah.
but like what are the limited things that genes are actually telling us? And yet we're still already. It's easier to imagine insurance companies and different social responses to this new information before we even know what we're looking at. We can already imagine the world that builds itself around this information, which acts as if genes are giving some answer that they're not really giving.
Exactly. And and to bring us back to, I mean, that's exactly what Bergson is basically saying now. I mean, you've basically put it exactly right. Bergson says, if we were to grab a human, put him into a lab, and we could dissect them any type of way, we could tell you exactly what you're made of, all the ways your internal
Right,
molecular things are rotating.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
We cannot tell you what the next moment's going to offer, though. Not until it comes to you, the being, to choose and actualize all that possibility, what Whitehead would describe as the eternal possibility, from the moment of process philosophy and process theology. But this is where I'm sure the actuaries of the world, the insurance agents of the world, they're ready. They're ready to start pumping that genetic information in and saying, hey, predicting the future from exactly that.
Yeah.
Bergson would say, "Hey, this is not on my watch." Now,
Yeah. I think
there,
all of modernity has kind of been a melting of the previous era, but not so that we have this new and liquid, brand new sort of era of liquidity, but so that we can make new and more refined solids, right? All that is solid melts into air, only so that it can condense back into a fucking more structured, rigid system. And I fear that's sort of what we tend to, well, at least it's not a choice that we consciously make. It's just the price of modernity, right? It's the ever prescient question of security versus freedom, which we are constantly
yeah,
embroiled with. It's this Gordian knot that we can't disentangle one from the other. And we'll always have to deal with it no matter what kind of society we become, no matter where we go, no matter who we are. We're always going to have to deal with these questions of security and freedom. And we don't know how. We're not going to know how to do that when it comes to issues of the body. We already see issues of the body and freedom and securities when it comes to, say, reproductive health rights. And we see how this has different material conditions on the ground depending on whereabouts in the world you are. But obviously, again, this is one huge discussion that is other to, we can talk
but
about it later
Yeah.
if you'd like.
I
it's one or several durations.
Yeah, well, several, and we're talking about many.
Cool. I think we should keep going. Jack, are you cool with keep reading?
No,
Continuing?
yeah, no, I think that perfectly puts us back into the text. I mean,
Mm.
so finally, duration and simultaneity recapitulates all of the possible hypotheses: generalized pluralism, limited pluralism, monism. According to the first, there is a coexistence of completely different rhythms, of durations that are really distinct, hence a radical multiplicity of time. Bergson adds that he once advanced this hypothesis, but considered that apart from ourselves, it was valid only for living species. We did not see then, we still see today, no reason to extend this hypothesis of a multiplicity of durations to the material universe. Hence, a second hypothesis: material things outside us would not be distinguished by absolutely different durations, but by a certain relative way of participating in our duration and of giving it emphasis. Here it seems that Bergson is condensing the provisional doctrine of time and free will. There is, as it were, a mysterious participation of things in our duration, an inexpressible ground. Oh, Cody, little Deleuze. And the more developed doctrine of creative evolution. This participation in our duration would be explained by things belonging to the whole of the universe. But even in this second case, the mystery about the nature of the whole and our relationship with it remains. Hence, the third hypothesis: there is only a single time, a single duration, in which everything would participate, including our consciousnesses, including living beings, including the whole material world. Now, to the reader's surprise, it is this hypothesis that Bergson puts forward as the most satisfactory. A single time, one, universal, impersonal. In short, a monism of time. Nothing could be more surprising. One of the other two hypotheses would seem to be a better expression of the state of Bergsonism, whether after matter memory or after creative evolution. What is more, has Bergson forgotten that in Time and Free Will he defined duration, that is real time, as a multiplicity? What happened? Undoubtedly, the confrontation with the theory of relativity. We can't forget, this confrontation was forced onto Bergson because relativity, for its part, invoked concepts such as expansion, contraction, tension, and dilation in relation to space and time. But this confrontation did not come about suddenly. It was prepared by the fundamental notion of multiplicity, which Einstein himself drew from Riemann, and which Bergson, for his part, had used in Time and Free Will. Let us recall briefly the principal characteristics of Einstein's theory, as Bergson summarizes them. Everything begins from a certain idea of movement that entails a contraction of bodies and a dilation of their time. From this, we conclude that there has been a dislocation of simultaneity. What is simultaneous in a fixed system ceases to be simultaneous in a mobile system. Moreover, by virtue of the relativity of rest and movement, by virtue of the relativity even of accelerated movement, these contractions of extensity, these dilations of time, these ruptures of simultaneity become absolutely reciprocal. In this sense, there would be a multiplicity of times, a plurality of times, with different speeds of flow, all real, each one peculiar to a system of reference. And as it becomes necessary in order to situate a point to indicate its position in time, as well as in space, the only unity of time is in a fourth dimension of space. Oh no. It is precisely this space-time block that actually divides up into space and into time in an infinity of ways, each one peculiar to a system. To what does this discussion relate? Contraction, dilation, relativity of movement, multiplicity. All these notions are familiar to Bergson. He uses them for his own purposes. Bergson never gives up the idea that duration, that is to say time, is essentially multiplicity. But the problem is, what type of multiplicity? Remember that Bergson opposed two types of multiplicity: actual multiplicities that are numerical and discontinuous, and virtual multiplicities that are continuous and qualitative. It is clear that in Bergson's terminology, Einstein's time belongs to the first category. Bergson criticizes Einstein for having confused the two types of multiplicities and for having, as a result, revived the confusion of time with space. Again, he was supposed to get us away from the ether. But I digress. The discussion only apparent only apparently deals with the question, is time one or multiple? The true problem is, what is the multiplicity peculiar to time? This clearly surfaces in Bergson's upholding of the existence of a single universal and impersonal time, time with a capital T. When we are sitting on the bank of a river, the flowing of the water, the gliding of a boat or the flight of a bird, the uninterrupted murmur of our deep life are for us three different things, or a single one, at will. Here, Bergson endows attention with the power of apportioning without dividing, of being one and several, like a poet, you know. But more profoundly, he endows duration with the power to encompass itself. The flowing of the water, the flight of the bird, the murmur of my life form, three fluxes, but only because my duration is one of them, and also the element that contains the two others. That's what's crucial. Why not make do with two fluxes, my duration and the flight of the bird, for example? Because the two fluxes could never be said to be coexistent or simultaneous if they were not contained in a third one. Cody, vanishing mediator. The flight of the bird and my own duration are only simultaneous insofar as my own duration divides in two and is reflected in another that contains it at the same time as it contains the flight of the bird. There is, therefore, a fundamental triplicity of fluxes. It is in this sense that my duration essentially has the power to disclose other durations, to encompass the others, and to encompass itself ad infinitum. But we see that this infinity of reflection or attention gives duration back its true characteristics, which must be constantly recalled. It is not simply the indivisible, but that which has a very special style of division. It's not simply succession, but a very special coexistence, a simultaneity of fluxes. Such is our first idea of simultaneity. We call simultaneous, then, two external fluxes that occupy the same duration because they hold each other in the duration of a third, our own. It is this simultaneity of fluxes that brings us back to internal duration, to real duration. Let us return to the characteristics by which Bergson defines duration as virtual or continuous multiplicity. On the one hand, it divides into elements that differ in kind. On the other, these elements, or these parts, only actually exist insofar as the division itself is effectively carried out. If our consciousness terminates the division at a given point, there also terminates divisibility. That's if we take up a position where the division has not yet been carried out, that is, in the virtual, it is obvious that there is only a single time. Then let us take up another position at a moment where the division has been carried out. Two fluxes. For example, that of Achilles' race and that of the tortoise's race. We say that they differ in kind, as do each step of Achilles and each step of the tortoise. If we take the division still further, the fact that the division is subject to the condition of actually being carried out means that the parts, fluxes, must be lived or at least posited and thought of as capable of being lived. Now, Bergson's whole thesis consists in demonstrating that they can only be livable or lived in the perspective of a single time. The principle of this demonstration is as follows. When we admit the existence of several times, we are not content to consider flux A and flux B, or even the image that the subject of A has of B. Achilles, as he conceives or imagines the tortoise's race, as capable of being lived by the tortoise. In order to posit the existence of two times, we are forced to introduce a strange factor, the image that A has of B. While nevertheless, knowing that B cannot live in this way, this factor is completely symbolic. In other words, it opposes and excludes the lived experience, and through it, and only it, is the so-called second time realized. From this, Bergson concludes that there exists one time, and one time only, as much on the level of the actual parts as on the level of the virtual whole. But what is the significance of this obscure demonstration? We shall soon see.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's take a quick break in the action.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've got some things to share, but I'm very happy for someone else to go first if you want. All right, fuck you guys. So what I'm thinking of, what comes to mind when speaking of the this sort of triplicity of fluxes is and this one will be familiar to everyone here, the Orchid and the Wasp, right? You have the aparallel evolution of the Wasp and the Orchid. You have this rhizomatic relationship where the rhizome that constitutes the Orchid Wasp isn't a third object in the same, or a third subject in the same degree that like an Orchid is to a Wasp. It's not a third thing that is like watching the two, but this virtual relationship between the two, right? It's not an actual relationship between the two because the Wasp and the Orchid don't particularly they're not the ways in which they touch each other, they don't one's a pollinator for the other and a specific pollinator for the other, but neither of the bodies have evolved around the other. They just so happen to be durations that exist within the same time as each other. And
Yeah.
And I think this is the case with any kind of arborescent system where there are often these co-causal relations which move backwards and forwards in time, where you can see how one body affects the other body, even if the bodies never actually touch. And I think this is a kind of it's a kind of a linear causality that is caused by this sort of reciprocal reproductive process where one attempts to become the other, the Orchid becoming Wasp, the Wasp becoming Orchid, and the Orchid deterritorializes by forming a memory or an image of the Wasp, a tracing of the Wasp, but the Wasp reterritorializes on that image. It reterritorializes on that memory. The Wasp is deterritorialized, becoming a piece of this Orchid's reproductive apparatus, but it in turn reterritorializes the Orchid by transporting its pollen. So it's almost as if the image A has a B is also flipped around. There's also an image that B has of A in the same way that A has of B, if this makes sense.
Absolutely.
So when it says that this factor is completely symbolic, so it opposes and excludes the lived experience and takes upon itself a different kind of time, its impression of time. So too does the other body in this relationship. But you have this third element, which is the rhizome, which is the system undergirding the sexual reproduction of both objects. And it's this rhizome, I believe, which is the one time.
Yes, exactly.
One time.
There needs to be a third
Even
thing.
if both subjects experience time differently, there's this one time which runs through them both. At least that's just maybe I'm wrong, but that's just what I'm getting from this.
Yeah, I think Cody could maybe speak on this of the what is grounding, because it's referenced pretty explicitly, I think. But there seems to be a need for this third thing in order for in order for these two heterogeneous times to be like a composite, or I guess a part of the composite of the singular time. So just because something, maybe the difficulty would be thinking like, well, singular must mean homogeneous. Well, no, singular actually contains like a heterogeneity to it. So there can still be these different speeds, flux, and flows and things, right, within a singular time. But because we're talking about immanence here and not transcendence, right? Because we're talking about immanence, this idea of a plane of immanence, which he'll go on later to talk about in like a lot of different texts of like what is philosophy. He has the book about pure immanence of life. Basically, this is a common theme of any Deleuze's books, is that everything must be contained within a particular, not even a universal necessarily either, but everything must be contained within a singular plane. But that doesn't necessarily mean that things can't change or be different. So the difference is contained within a singular plane, and this plane would be the third thing. There always is a third thing. It's always the same third thing. So I think I think clearly, if y'all agree, I think the answer of one or many durations, like it is both, but it's how you situate that one and many is what kind of makes the difference.
One and many durations.
Exactly. So, who would like to keep going?
I think Cody had something to say, right?
Yeah, sorry. Nope, nothing from Cody. Okay, sorry.
No, they were unmuting.
Yeah, sorry. No, because otherwise we'll get lost in the source. However, where I wanted to go, I want to say, so for the grounding thing, I'd say we'll leave that. I actually think it's in Lacan, where both the idea of this grounding as being relative to the conscious beings experiencing it. So like what they're saying, the duration of the person by the river and the duration of the bird both being situated by this third thing, I believe completely collapses in what Lacan calls the big other. This third being supposed to know who situates, and obviously this has already been brought up, we've said the vanishing mediator, or Hegel calls it absolute spirit, so we can get lost in that, but I don't want to do any of that because that's gay. I think that where we're going to go next, and I think the only real one out of all the German idealists, out of all these other figures, or all the psychoanalysts that one should ever refer to, the only other system that we should refer to when we're reading Bergson is the Spinozan system, because it's in precisely the two texts on Spinoza that we're dealing with exactly the same questions. When we first read it, it was made to be that it was the same question for Deleuze at first. It was the same questions that Nietzsche was asking, that Spinoza was asking, the questions of atheism, materialism, and empiricism. And now I think it's going to be the case of all the questions that Bergson is asking were the questions that Spinoza asked, that of the relation between monism, between absolute and infinite substance, and between its pluralist particular extensions. And we could very easily get lost in it, but I think Bergson and right now Deleuze is going to do that for us. So I'll shut up. We'll do some reading, and then we'll come back to it, and then we'll discuss a little bit more after we've read some more pages. Is my mic okay? If it sounds okay, I would like to do a couple of pages, please. Yeah.
I was about to say, do the opposite, shut up and continue reading if you want.
Awesome. Okay. Oh, starting from if we follow the division, right?
Yes.
If we follow the division in the other direction, if we go back, we see the fluxes each time with their differences in kind, with their differences of contraction and expansion, détente, communicating in a single and identical time with a big T, which is, as it were, their condition. In quotes, our single duration will pick up along its route the events of the totality of the material world, and we will then be able to eliminate the human consciousness that we had initially had available. Every now and then, as so many relays for the movement of our thought, there will now only be impersonal time in which all things will flow. Hence the triplicity of fluxes. Our duration, the duration of the spectator, being necessary both as flux and as representative of time with the big T, in which all fluxes are engulfed. It is in this sense that Bergson's various texts are perfectly reconcilable and contain no contradiction. Now here we go. There is only one time monism, one substance. Although there is an infinity of actual fluxes, generalized pluralism, that necessarily participate in the same virtual whole, limited pluralism. Bergson in no way gives up the idea of a difference in kind between actual fluxes any more than he gives up the idea of differences of relaxation or contraction in the virtuality that encompasses them and is actualized in them. But he considers that these two certainties do not exclude, but on the contrary, imply a single time. In short, not only do virtual multiplicities imply a single time, but duration as virtual multiplicity is this single and same time. It is nonetheless true that the Bergsonian demonstration of the contradictory character of the plurality of times seems obscure. Let us clarify it at the level of the theory of relativity, for, paradoxically, only this theory makes it appear clear and convincing. Insofar as we are dealing with qualitatively distinct fluxes, it may in fact be difficult to know whether or not the two subjects live and perceive the same time. We support unity, but only as the most plausible idea. On the other hand, the theory of relativity is based on the following hypotheses. There are no longer qualitative fluxes, but systems in a state of reciprocal and uniform replacement, where the observers are interchangeable, since there is no longer a privileged system. Let us accept this hypothesis. Einstein says that the time of the two systems, S and S', is not the same. But what is this other time? It is not that of Peter in S, nor that of Paul in S', since by hypothesis these two times only differ quantitatively, and this difference is cancelled out when one takes S and S' as systems of reference in turn. Could it at least be said that this other time is the one that Peter conceives as lived or capable of being lived by Paul? Not at all. And this is the essential point of the Bergsonian argument. Undoubtedly, Peter sticks a label on this time in the name of Paul. But if he imagined Paul conscious, living his own duration and measuring it, for this very reason he would see Paul take his own system as a system of reference, and then place himself in this single time, internal to each system, which we have just been speaking of. Moreover, also for this very reason, Peter would provisionally surrender his system of reference and in consequence his existence as physicist, and in consequence also his consciousness. Peter would now only see himself as a vision of Paul. In short, the other time is something that can neither be lived by Peter nor by Paul as Peter imagines him. It is a pure symbol, excluding the lived and indicating simply that such a system, and not the other, is taken as a reference point. Peter no longer envisages Paul as a physicist, nor even a conscious being, nor even a being. He empties from his conscious and living interior the visual image of Paul, only retaining the external envelope of the character. Thus, in the relativity hypothesis, it becomes obvious that there can only be a single livable and lived time, natura naturans, natura naturata. This demonstration goes beyond the relativist hypothesis, since qualitative differences in their turn cannot constitute numerical distinctions. This is why Bergson claims that relativity in fact demonstrates the opposite of what it asserts about the plurality of time. All Bergson's other criticisms derive from this. For what simultaneity does Einstein have in mind when he states that it varies from one system to the other, relative? A simultaneity defined by the readings of two distinct clocks. And it is true that this simultaneity is variable or relative, but precisely because its relativity expresses not something lived or livable, but the symbolic factor of which we have just been speaking. In this sense, this simultaneity presupposes two others linked in the instant, simultaneities that are not variable but absolute. the simultaneity between two instants taken from external movements, a nearby phenomenon and the motion of a clock, and the simultaneity of these instants with the instants taken by them from our duration. And these two simultaneities presuppose yet another, that of the fluxes, which is even less variable. The Bergsonian theory of simultaneity thus tends to confirm the conception of duration as the virtual coexistence of all the degrees of a single and identical time. In short, from the first page of Duration and Simultaneity to the last, Bergson criticizes Einstein for having confused the virtual and the actual. The introduction of the symbolic factor, that is, of a fiction, expresses this confusion. He is criticized, therefore, for having confused the two types of multiplicity, virtual and actual. At the heart of the question, is duration one or multiple, we find a completely different problem. Duration is a multiplicity, but of what type? Only the hypothesis of a single time can, according to Bergson, account for the nature of virtual multiplicities. By confusing the two types, actual spatial multiplicity and virtual temporal multiplicity, Einstein has merely invented a new way of spatializing time. And we cannot deny the originality of his space-time and the stupendous achievement it represents for science. Spatialization has never been pushed so far or in such a way, following Riemann and so on. But this achievement is that of a symbol for expressing composites, not that of something experienced that is capable, as Proust would say, of expressing a little time in the pure state. Being with a big B, or time with a big T, is a multiplicity, but it is precisely not multiple. It is one, in conformity with its type of multiplicity.
Okay. I think we found the area of the chapter that we're gonna have to sit on for a bit. This one's a bit of an egg. The only comments I have are on Einstein and on Kant. I don't actually have anything on the content itself, unfortunately. I've only got adjacent comments to make.
Go for it.
Well, the only thing I want to talk about is I like all the talk about Einstein because it reminds me an awful lot of there was a talk given in Cambridge in I think it was the very start of the war, 1914, by a guy called J.B.S. Haldane. He was a cracked scientist. He was like a physicist, but also a biologist and also a chemist and all this shit, right? Also a Marxist. He was a very interesting guy. And he gave this talk called Daedalus, or Science in the Future, where he's just he's shitposting about science. Basically, he's talking about where is science going, what are we doing, what are we doing, guys? Is science a genie that's left the bottle, or can we just stop doing science? If we chose to, could we stop? And in it, he speaks about how the face of truth and the face of science have shifted over the eras. And he speaks about Einstein and he speaks about Kant. And what he says, I think he says Einstein is the greatest Jew since Jesus, is what he says in his talk. He says, what else does he say about Einstein? There was something specific which would be relevant for this. So he spoke. He speculated on the practical consequences of Einstein's discovery, because this again is about 100 years ago. So Einstein's theory is it's funky fresh. It's still new. It's really shaking the world. But Haldane had no doubt that he would be believed because he's already given signs of relativity, right? A prophet who can give signs in the heavens is always believed, right? No one really doubted Newton after the return of Halley's Comet, right? And so what Einstein basically said was that space, time, and matter are all shadows of the fifth dimension. And when he could provide proof of this, the heavens declare his glory, right? And so, as a consequence of Einstein, Kantian idealism becomes now the base working hypothesis of any physicist who is going to seriously be considered a physicist, right? Every scientist is a materialist now, even though every scientist has not always been a materialist. What Haldane was interested in is, what is this next step? What's going to make us look back at Einstein as if he were Haley, right? Like, good for a moment, but only good for that moment. Where's the next movement going to come from? Which is very forward thinking when Einstein's just starting to come into flavor. And his theory was maybe it would look a little bit like Bergsonian activism. Maybe that will be the thing that in 100 years, in 200 years, our great-great-grandchildren will look back at us quaintly as we look back at the early materialists, as we look back at them, he was saying, to us, it's natural to study the movements of the Thames, to study influenza, to study chemical engineering, to study Marxism using materialism, but perhaps this will be antiquated in 200 years' time. And if this is the case, how do we further understand what this actual process that science is continuing, what is it actually doing? What are we doing with science? Are we moving forward as quickly as possible to a kind of truth, or just to the next understanding? What are we actually capable of when we, produce science? What are we doing? I just wanted to bring that up. That was all. It was like I said, it was an adjacent comment. It wasn't particularly talking about the content, but I thought it was interesting how it all came up in someone else's discussions hundreds of years ago.
I think that's a good point, particularly because I've been reading this book on Deleuze, Bergson, and Merleau-Ponty by Deborah Olkowski, and one of the points that she brings up pretty consistently is that Bergson did not have any material issue with the theory of relativity, right? It's kind of a weird mistake that they even their debate is a really strange one, because it wasn't even that Bergson disagreed that relativity was a step in the right direction in terms of understanding matter, right? He totally bought into that, and he agreed with Einstein on that point. But what Bergson was looking to do wasn't to just understand matter, but to also understand kind of another thing that's more creative, you could say elan vital, and that is more metaphysical. And what he saw is that physical sciences and metaphysics were two kind of ways of understanding the two multiplicities which Deleuze is bringing up. And really, in order to have a complete singular study of anything, you can't just look at one or the other. You have to look at both in tandem. And and in understanding that there are qualitative differences between these multiplicities is vital. So I think it's totally relevant. I also think we should let's finish up this last bit, because we're so close to the end.
Absolutely.
Do you want to read, Joby?
Yeah, I'd love to. Let's see, how much is left?
I think just a few more pages, basically. Yeah.
4 pages.
Yeah, not that bad.
Yeah, it's fine to me. Yeah, I'm happy to continue. All right, let's finish this. When Bergson defends the uniqueness of time, he does not retract anything he has said previously about the virtual coexistence of various degrees of relaxation and contraction, and the difference in kind between fluxes or actual rhythms. When he says that space and time never overlap nor intertwine, when he maintains that their only distinction is real, He does not retract any of the ambiguity of matter and memory, which consisted in integrating something of space into duration, in order to find in duration a sufficient reason of extension. What he condemns from the start is the whole combination of space and time into a badly analyzed composite, where space is considered as ready-made, and time, in consequence, the fourth dimension of space. And this spatialization of time is undoubtedly inseparable from science. But relativity is characterized by its having pushed this spatialization forward, welding the composite together in a completely new way. For in pre-relativist science, time assimilated to a fourth dimension of space is nevertheless an independent and really distinct variable. In relativity, on the other hand, the assimilation of space to time is necessary in order to express the invariance of distance, so that it is explicitly introduced into the calculations and does not allow any real distinction to subsist. In short, relativity has formed an especially close-knit mixture, but a mixture that is part of the Bergsonian critique of the composite in general. On the other hand, from Bergson's point of view, we can, in fact we must, conceive of combinations that depend on a completely different principle. So let's consider the degrees of expansion and of contraction, all of which coexist with one another. So at the limit of expansion, we have matter. While undoubtedly matter is not yet space, it is already extensity. A duration that is infinitely slackened and relaxed places its moments outside one another. One must have disappeared when the other appears. What these moments lose in reciprocal penetration, they gain in respective spreading. What they lose in tension, they gain in extension, so that at each moment, everything tends to be spread out into an instantaneous, indefinitely divisible continuum, which will not prolong itself into the next instant, but will pass away, only to be reborn in the following instant in a flicker or shiver that constantly begins again. It would be sufficient to push this movement of expansion to its limit in order to obtain space, but space would then be found at the end of the line of a differentiation as the extreme ending that is no longer combined with duration. Space, in effect, is not matter or extension, but the schema of matter. That is, the representation of the limit where the movement of expansion would come to an end as the external envelope of all possible extensions. In this sense, it is not matter, it is not extensity that is in space, but the very opposite. And if we think that matter has 1,000 ways of becoming expanded or extended, we must also say that there are all kinds of distinct extensities, all related, but still qualified, and which will finish by intermingling only in our own schema of space. The essential point is to see how expansion and contraction are relative and relative to one another. What is expanded if not the contracted? And vice versa, what is contracted if not the extended, the expanded? This is why there is always extensity in our duration and always duration in matter. When we perceive, we contract millions of vibrations or elementary shocks into a felt quality. But what we contract, what we tense in this way is matter, extension. In this sense, there is no point in wondering if there are spatial sensations, which ones are or are not. All our sensations are extensive. All are voluminous or extended, although to varying degrees and in different styles depending on the type of contraction that they carry out. And qualities belong to matter as much as to ourselves. They belong to matter. They are in matter by virtue of the vibrations and numbers that punctuate them internally. Extensities are thus still qualified since they are inseparable from the contractions that become expanded in them, and matter is never expanded enough to be pure space, to stop having this minimum of contraction through which it participates in duration, through which it is part of duration. Conversely, duration is never contracted enough to be independent of the internal matter where it operates, and of the extension that it comes to contract. Let's return to the image of the inverted cone. Its point, R present, represents the most contracted point of R duration, but it also represents our insertion in the least contracted, that is, in an infinitely relaxed matter. And this is why, according to Bergson, intelligence has two correlative aspects, forming an ambiguity that is essential to it. It is acquaintance with matter, it marks adaptation to matter, it molds itself on matter. But it only does so by means of mind or duration, by placing itself in matter in a point of tension that allows it to master matter. In intelligence, one must therefore distinguish between form and sense. It has its form in matter. It finds its form with matter, that is, in the most expanded, but it has and finds its sense in the most contracted, through which it dominates and utilizes matter. It might therefore be said that its form separates intelligence from its meaning, but that this meaning always remains present in it and must be rediscovered by intuition. This is why, in the final analysis, Bergson refuses all simple genesis, which would account for intelligence on the basis of an already presupposed order of matter, or which would account for the phenomena of matter on the basis of the supposed categories of intelligence. There can only be a simultaneous genesis of matter and intelligence. One step for one step for the other. Intelligence is contracted in matter at the same time as matter is expanded in duration. Both find the form that is common to them, their equilibrium, in extensity, even if intelligence in its turn pushes this form to a degree of expansion that matter and extensity would never have attained by themselves, that of a pure space. Okay. That's chapter 4. Oh, man. It is harder to generate thoughts when you're the one speaking.
It most certainly is. That was a very challenging section, I would say. Probably the most that last part. I think I'm trying to really get what's happening, because in the before the three ellipses, we saw that like that the differences in kinds between the two multiplicities, right? They are all contained within a single time. But then we see after the ellipses, I think, this discussion of pure space. But I think what's interesting is that when he's talking about space, he's saying that like space and time are definitely wrapped up within each other, and that there is like it seems like he's saying there's an extension in there's a form of extension that's within like memory or like kind of metaphysics, but there's also an intention within space.
Well, all memory has a duration, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a memory. It would be an instant that is lost completely.
Okay.
And so if memory has a duration, it needs to be played out to that duration, which means it needs to be contained within a bigger box, as it were, that has a longer duration than itself so that it can be played out. Does that make sense? If you've got a box that you can only look inside for 30 seconds, but in that box is a smaller box, which you can only look inside for 5 seconds, then you can contain one box within the other. but you can't contain the second box within the first box, as it were, right? Because its duration is too short to contain the longer duration. And the reason I bring this up, sorry to interrupt you, the only reason I bring this up is because what I find really funny about Bergson is he has a very, like, we kind of like lose our minds trying to catch up with all these meanings. We're like trying to keep up with it, and it all sounds really complicated. What does it mean that matter's in time? What does it mean that duration's in matter and all this? But then we think, oh yeah, of course, yeah, I'm aging. Yeah, look in any tree. You can see the rings inside the tree. You can see the oaken core as it spreads out, as it lasts through time, as its duration increases. Of course, things age. Like, yeah, absolutely. Of course, we see duration within matter.
Yeah.
Of course, we see one of one inside the other. I think the only difficult thing about this final bit of this fourth chapter is that the relationships are not mirrored. There's not a exact same and mirrored relationship within one
Yeah.
another. It's that where is it? Where does he say it?
Well, I have an example that I can think of that
please.
speaks to what you're saying. So like in Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? Like the beginning of the show, we know that Aang, the last Airbender, right? We know that he has been frozen in an iceberg for 100 years, but he is still, I think, like 12 years old or something, right? He's still like not even basically a preteen from these 100 years, right? Usually if you were able to live to the pretty old age of 112 years old, right, you would have some sort of physical mark of that time. But because he basically was cryogenicized within his own like forming of this iceberg, right, by going into the avatar state and making himself into an iceberg, right, there is no physical mark of that time, and even like intensely, right, he still very much is at the immature state of being, a child who doesn't want to have this intense responsibility thrown onto him. But if you were to just go off of like the quantitative number of like, well he's existed for 112 years, right, you would probably think like, oh yeah, he's surely mature enough. But really, like that kind of does show that they're like the physical mark of time isn't something that is like eternal, right? Like it's not something that's a matter of
not uniform.
It's not a matter of fact.
It's not, I like that. It's not uniform. It's it's one single time, but it includes all these different intensities within such. Where a body could swallow up the time of another body and thus be spared from time for a moment, only to be re-injected back into that duration. Like being cryogenically frozen in the iceberg, you're kind of swallowing up the duration of the iceberg, and then continuing your life from that. Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a lot of different ways you could think about that. And
even there's other examples too, right, where like where people like smoking cigarettes, right? We know that like it'll age your body pretty significantly a lot faster, at least like your skin, right? Like people who smoke for like 20 years, their skin will start to kind of shrivel up and wrinkle up way sooner than it would for somebody who's a non-smoker, right? So this physical mark of time it speeds up, even though time itself doesn't necessarily speed up, right? Like the singular universal time doesn't speed up. There's still these intensities, right? But these intensities are also extensities because they have their own physical mark. I think the way you're explaining it, I think that is basically what Deleuze is saying, even if it's couched within this kind of complexity.
Yeah, I like that though. I like how there's this there are these dual relationships which bear an obvious there's an obvious relationship between these two different relationships, and yet how was it put earlier in the chapter? They were talking about A and B. The image that A has of B, well, then nevertheless knowing that B cannot live this way, meaning this difference is symbolic, that it takes on a lived experience and cannot also live that experience because its duration disallows itself from being that duration. And yet, this is perfectly viable within one singular time. It's not that you have to have subjects within time that only share the same duration, but that they can share durations of different proportions, of different intensities, because they're all contained within, as we said earlier, this larger box, which is a duration which can contain all duration, if you want to think of it that way. One duration which contains all duration.
It's really cool because I think what Deleuze does maybe a little bit better than Bergson here, right, is that like, I at least, Jack, you could disagree with me here, and you might, but I think that like Bergson might sometimes be too reductive on the side of like the qualitative, and I at least what I'm getting from like Deleuze is he's almost like within this book Bergsonism, I do see him trying to maybe correct some of the even like maybe not mistakes that Bergson makes, but maybe like the ways that Bergson could be read uncharitably, because and he does that through Bergson, of course, but I'm having trouble like articulating like a specific example, but I really do think that like Deleuze, by showing the extensity to like memory and also the intensity to space, right? Like by showing that there is, in a sense, an impure mixture, but that also can be abstracted to being kind of having the more pure realm. He's able to kind of make those correctives that I think really cement the point. I don't know.
No, I agree for the most part. I don't. What did you think Jack would disagree with out of interest? Like before, or what part of it did you think Jack would disagree with?
I don't know.
Out of complete curiosity.
Jack is just a expert Bergsonian, so I fear to say anything wrong in his presence more than anything. But I think Whenever
anyone says I think you'll disagree with me, I'm expecting source, but all I hear is facts coming from you.
I'm just it's more out of a preemptive fear than actually the actually being wrong.
So I think every good student fears their fucking tutor.
So we are at about over an hour and a half right now, which is pretty long. Does anyone have any closing comments so that we could end the recording? Cody or Jack?
Well, yeah, Cody, if you don't mind, if you want to jump in, I can take it. If not,
maybe Jack then Cody.
So we find ourselves struggling with three elements: monism, which speaks of a system time, a one time, which Bergson seems to like. We want to keep. But we also have a generalized pluralism and an infinity of actual fluxes. However, also a third element of limited pluralism, a same virtual whole that we all are trying to encounter. Now, this leads us down to a kind of triplicity, a third kind of multiplicity, a series of three simultaneities that essentially gets us to Proust. I mean, that's the easiest way to put it. Proust, or we could almost say, I wanted to use this example of Goodwill Hunting talks about, do you think you would really know the life of an orphan by reading Oliver Twist? That really says it. Peter has a time. Paul has a time. Peter can't really understand Paul's time. If to say that he could would be to say that we know exactly how an orphan lives by reading Oliver Twist. It takes so much away from lived experience by talking in this symbolic way. Now, all Bergson is doing is taking this poetic truth to Einstein himself, and that is ultimately why I think Ponty agrees that Bergson wins the debate against Einstein, because he's not really even debating against Einstein. That's what's curious. Bergson subsumes Einstein, like you said, Marcy. Bergson's not going against any sort of science that Einstein's bringing. He's simply saying that Einstein, there's metaphysics to be done, And look, I've done my homework. Kant laid out what you need to do if you're going to do metaphysics after Hume. There's this prolegomena, There's these critique of pure reasons. So what Bergson and Deleuze are pointing out is that Kant and Einstein have missed something. They're not wrong, they're just missing something. What are they missing? They're confusing actual multiplicity with virtual multiplicity. Einstein gives us a beautiful system, and that allows us to do this beautiful thing that we call science. However, if you were to ask Hume if he was a scientist or a philosopher, he would be confused at the question. Kant saves the scientist by hobbling together a metaphysical system we call critique of pure reason. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but we're coming for it. We're coming for it with Bergson and Deleuze because it's not enough. It's found lacking. It's great for science. Don't get me wrong, and I'm saying this as a person. I've taken classes of special theory of relativity, and when tackling the theories of Einstein, you are kind of scratching your head at what the heck is he talking about time? And not to get too into the debate, it's really summarized by this. Why do we need a clock to talk about philosophy of time? Could we have talked about time before a clock? Arguing there's something that we are simplifying by speaking of time only in terms of a clock. And again, that is to confuse the actual with the virtual.
It's like,
now,
I mean, sorry, one comment. It's a little bit like saying, "Oh, I fully understand I fully understand the pseudo-cyclical, so I understand cyclicity." And it's like, oh, I understand a spiral, so therefore I understand a circle. And it's like, it's so rough to say whether you do or not, right? It's so hard to make that. You see the impression of one in the other, but do you see the other? It's the whole thing about, is there enough of a flux in the present matter that I'm looking at right now, or do I need to delve into its ontological past? Do I need to look at a previous iteration of this thing to now fully get the thing? Or can I just see the thing that's in front of me? Can I just use this? And will we ever know if what we see is a perfect representation of what we want it to be?
Oh, and exactly, and we can play with the symbolism. So we can point at envelopes, the external envelope, and say, "Look, we got it summed up objectively. There it is." We don't have to describe the internal experience of the thing. This is the tricks that we can come into in philosophy because of Einstein. And I will summarize this all in a beautiful William James quote, and then I'll turn it over to Cody. William James put it perfectly. Deleuze sees it. Our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness, entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch they are all there in all of their completeness. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. That's our claim. We're not taking your theories away from you, Einstein. We're just saying you haven't characterized all of the universe if you're forgetting internal experiences. It's not all objectivity, baby.
Brilliant. Cody, any closing thoughts? Cody, are you there?
2 seconds.
So, yeah, microphone on. Fuck me, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yep.
I can hear you.
For God's sake, I'll try and follow on from that. Yeah. Einstein discovered for us the intelligible. And I'm trying to bring it back to what the ending of this chapter does, which is first he wants to describe to us intelligence, and by that we mean exploring and discovering the genetic condition. That is, being the most contracted point, understanding the most expanded, and so on and so on. Being the most relaxed point, understanding its all these virtual coexistencies, this imagery of the inverted cone, ignoring all of that. If intelligence is then understanding one's genetic condition, understanding the order or schema by which things come to make sense, that is to say that there is indeed a transcendental category. It's a very Kantian thing. There's this real way of seeing things. Einstein's relativity. There's this real way of understanding time. Time is a fourth dimension. Intuition as method, as I'm glad that this chapter ends on, isn't going, you're bloody wrong because Einstein, you can't think of time without a clock. We're just adding that intuitive element into what's already being said. We're saying, here's one genetic condition, but there isn't one absolute genetic condition. This would be to fall into Kantian transcendentalism all over again. And it's exactly the very way that we're trying to deal with all of Kant, all of German idealism, is to avoid this pothole of there is one genetic condition, we can't go beyond it. There is one articulation of the real, and we can't go beyond it. And blah, blah, blah. Intuition just then reintroduces this idea that the genetic condition itself moves. There is, and there are never words that this chapter's been exploring, there is one duration, big duration, like big T for time, big B for being, and at the same time, this one duration, this one genetic condition, this one whatever, expresses fully its multiplicity. That is to say, it moves. By the time you've already intelligibly announced it, in the same way Einstein announces time as the fourth dimension, that time is relative. Intuition here for the philosopher kicks in, and we say, that's so good. It's so good what you've got there. It's almost too good that there is something not missed per se, but you've now opened up an avenue. You've now opened up a channel for exploration. Why? Because perception is exactly that which takes less out of the real. It's always lesser. That's exactly what Einstein does. It's exactly how Bergson comes for him. Your perception is fantastic. Relativity is fantastic, but it's only a piece. Yeah. It's only one duration amongst many. And that's why we must always, always go back to that first chapter. Intuition as method. Intelligence is wonderful and great, and this is probably one of the most intelligent books, because I for one, don't understand it. I, for one, am struggling. Every page is a struggle. But with intuition as method guiding me there, I don't have to know it. You don't have to know it. And this will be the basis of Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. You don't have to know what's going on. What happens is you are affected, like music, like we were saying with Beethoven and the Ninth. You have to be affected, you have to be compelled, and then you have to explore. You have to explore rhythms and durations in the same way one explores the sugar melting, and in the same way the sugar melting explores us watching it, and so on and so on. What a beautiful text.
Yeah. What
a beautiful reading. I can't wait for the next chapter. Hopefully not so long. Hopefully not so many weeks.
I think it's the last chapter coming up. So I think with that beautiful closing remark, we should end the recording so that our listeners don't have to hear us talk for another half hour. Thank you for listening, everyone.
If possible, yeah.
And yeah.
Or if possible, I just want to wiggle in there for 30 seconds if that's okay. I'm so sorry.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah.
All I wanted to say was, I think just largely in concordance with what Jack and Cody have said, the text is difficult. It's indecipherable. And as soon as it passes into decipherability, it's become something else completely, right?
Mm-hmm.
As it passes over into language, it's already become something else. And so, but the sort of, I think the pull of Bergson in general, pull towards intuition, the pull towards what's attractive about being able to look at a text like this, see how chunky it is, but then remember, actually there's some really beautiful Einstein himself spoke about. I like how everyone touched on Einstein because he feels very important for this chapter. But even Einstein himself admits you can't explain lived experience using my theory. Space-time doesn't talk about this. You can explain the motions of gods in the heavens, the stars, right? What used to be considered the gods. You can explain these movements using space-time, but you can't explain people with space-time. And I think it's this human drive to try to understand what seems at first obvious, only to then be pulled away from us. I think that's one of the reasons why Bergson's so attractive. Yeah. And I essentially just wanted to echo that statement. I needed my 30-second soapbox.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Bergson's got that grip.
Fatty batty.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Let's we'll end the recording here, but much love.
Thank you.
Much love.